Hi, everyone. We will begin with questions in this room, and meanwhile, people in the Zoom room can post their questions in chat, and I will get those questions in my phone, and we will raise those questions later. So when I look at my phone, I'm checking the questions. I'm listening. So people in this room first, do you have any questions for our speaker?
No. Can you just go over a bit more detail? How does the lament turn into positive action?
Sure. The book of Lamentations actually doesn't end up that way, as you may know. Actually, this was my work with Ellen Davis when I was at Duke, and how Ellen would look at the Psalms and see them not as, that they were redacted and curated in a particular way. So that sometimes within the individual Psalms, the lament doesn't necessarily find closure. It actually extends. So that's part of, to me, the lesson of lament is not, it doesn't always end on a happy note, but is there another chapter to the story, is maybe the way we look at it, a longer view on what lament looks like. So one of the examples that I often use around lament as an ongoing process is one pet peeve that I really am always upset about is when churches end their Good Friday service on a happy note. I don't understand that, because that's the point of Good Friday, is that there's been a crucifixion, there's a death. Just wait 2 days and then the joy will come with the resurrection. But there's even that kind of short-sightedness and short attention span, that to stay in the pain is not something that we're able to do. So I'm not saying that the joy and the hope doesn't emerge. It's part of that is the patience to be able to say, we might be in a place of lament where is it delayed, or is it something that comes in the next chapter? That might be something that we begin to acknowledge. The other part of that is the book of Lamentations, really interesting way of closing. So in the first 4 chapters, Jeremiah does, the redactor, the editor, does show up. He shows up as the prophet narrator. If you read the book, there's little points where Jeremiah says, I, the prophet narrator, and it kind of, but he pops in and then the women's voices speak. So it's just kind of like by the 5th chapter, Jeremiah's voice completely disappears. And by the time you get to the 5th chapter of Lamentations, it actually follows the more traditional format of a lament that you see in the Psalms. But it goes deeper than that. It's not just following the traditional format of lament. It's the one time in the book of Lamentations where the people actually directly speak to God, not through the prophet mediator and not in terms of, and so it actually becomes a direct plea. So if I'm looking specifically at how lament closes out in the book of Lamentations, the joy for me is that the people actually are empowered to pray for themselves directly to God. That to me is the culmination of Lamentations. In fact, if you look at the content of Lamentations, you could say this is terrible because it actually ends on a downbeat. It actually ends on a kind of a downer of a note in chapter 5, at the end of chapter 5. But if you look at the flow of the whole book, the joy is the people not only pray for themselves, they have the agency to be able to pray to God. And so, I mean, we think of a kind of the joy and hope comes when, because the joy and hope in our mind would be, well, after they lament, they're brought back from exile and then everything's okay, right? But that doesn't happen until many chapters later or many books later. So that's kind of the delayedness of the possibility of hope. But the goal of Lamentations is not necessarily the hope and joy at the end of it is not Israel now is restored to the days of old. In fact, in Micah, we see Israel still, Haggai rather, they're still struggling with how their temple that was rebuilt is not as glorious as the previous temple. So they still have this expectation of this restoration. Their hope and their fulfillment is going to be when Israel is restored into this powerful nation. That doesn't happen. So sometimes our expectation of what is the hope also needs to be tempered. To me, the hope is the people not only pray for themselves, they now have the agency and the desire to pray directly to God. That is the culmination of Lamentations. But we also know that if we're looking specifically at Jerusalem and the temple, the fulfillment is Jesus. My favorite passage in the book of Haggai, my favorite storyline in the book of Haggai is how the people rebuild the temple after they return from exile. It's a mess, nothing like Solomon's temple. Does it look like to you like nothing, is what Haggai says to them. And then they look at the temple, and then Haggai says, but the glory of this temple will surpass the glory of the previous temple. Why? Because Jesus actually shows up in that temple. So the hope is not only deferred, the hope is found in unexpected places. One, the people pray for themselves, but also the hope that the desire of all nations will come and fill this temple with glory, which will look different than what Solomon's temple looked like. So the hope now has been tempered, and it now looks different than what it was previously.
Any other questions or follow-up questions for that?
Hi, my name is Hyun. I live in Pasadena.
Oh,
maybe
okay.
close to you.
Yeah, we probably walk there to each other, back thousands of miles away.
I'm actually full graduate. So
Okay.
my question is, your message of lamentation is more focusing on for the church or for the state or
Yes.
the whole society. I think maybe our approach to that message is very different. If we, the goal of the target of your message is church or the society. That's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I mean, obviously in the Old Testament, you get some conflation of the spiritual community and but that's why I love the book of Lamentations, because it's coming from the people and it's not coming from the privilege. I mean, that was the whole paradigm that was set up. It's not coming from King David's perspective, or even from the prophet Jeremiah's perspective. It's coming from the people. And so I think a message of lament that speaks to the community as a whole is an important part of that. Now, yes, it is a spiritual community, and they view themselves as God's people, but at the same time, it's not the spiritual community of leaders that is speaking up. It is actually the common folk that are speaking. And that to me becomes a lesson of how does that become a part of the culture. Actually, let me draw something real quick. The way I've distinguished this is, think of it this way. If you have a momentum moving in this direction, so think of like a hill, and there's a big wheel at the top, and it's a hollow wheel. And your little dog is at the bottom of the hill. And you're here in the middle. And this starts rolling down the hill. And you want to stop this from killing your dog. So you get in front of it, and you're the heroic individual that's going to stop. And of course, this has too much momentum. It's going to kill you and kill the dog. Or so you decide to jump into the middle of it and say, if I get in the middle of it, maybe I can stop it. But then what you end up doing is you end up adding weight to it, and now moves faster and there's more weight to it. So the way I'm looking at that is that if this is the broken society and this is the church or God's people, we've tried to heroically as an individual try to stop it and got steamrolled by it. Or we've tried to get into the system and try to change it. And we see that, and again, in US context, we see where many Christians just bought into the political system and are pawns of the one political party. So if we're getting the system, we're going to end up sometimes getting caught up in the system. So if there is a momentum that moves in this direction, the individual, heroic individual, or joining the system, what we really need to do is create momentum in the opposite direction. So if a wheel is moving in this direction, you have to create momentum in the opposite direction. And this is what, if society is the broken momentum or movement, then we create a counter movement that actually demonstrates something different. Because we can't heroically, individually change the system. We can't try to join the system and fix it. We create a counter movement to the system. And that's where lament is that counter movement, because it presents a different narrative Especially if you're in this context, the narrative and the momentum is, and again, this is Western culture, and I would argue Korean churches maybe operate in the similar vein of triumphalism, exceptionalism, consumerism, materialism, success-driven narratives. We're going to build bigger churches and stronger churches and more powerful churches. We've joined society's momentum and bought into that narrative, whereas this counter momentum, like introducing Lament, is actually creating what King would identify as the beloved community, but also a counter narrative to the existing dysfunctional narrative.
Thank you. Let's have another question from the room.
Yeah, hi, my name is EK, and I was in the Buena Park, Orange County area, 40 minutes from the Pasadena. And I met you before, I think it was 2018, 2017, you came to the Paju University as a guest speaker, but I thought that you were Chinese, Pastor Rah.
I get Japanese a lot too because of that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, truly apologize to that.
No, that's okay. I'm reconciling all the different people groups.
And my question also goes to those kind of I'm now serving for the refugee friends from the Afghanistan. Usually, recently, Korean government called them special contributor. What that means, special contributor, they escaped from the Afghan to South Korea due to the Taliban that arrested them. And my question was that, can it be possible to address with the lament toward non-believers? Usually, I thought about the lament is able to stretch out to the inside of the church or Christianity, or as even the North American Christianity facing post-Christendom, that they started to think about that pluralistic context, can it be possible to preach on them, to the, you know what I mean, Mr. Rah, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And some of you know that my area of teaching in the seminary is on evangelism. And in a post-Christendom era or a Christendom era, it is very worthwhile to explore these uncovered or undercovered practices like lament. So part of, and I alluded to this, but there was a study done in the US about worship life, and the worship life indicated that the typical American hymnal is 85% praise and 15% lament, something to that effect. So I said it was 60-40 in the Bible, so think of how disproportional it is, 85-15. So what that indicates for us is that the patterns of worship life in the West have mimicked the assumptions around the place of the church, places of authority, places of power. Now, when that changes, you either run away and hide from it, like what the American church is doing, and say, "Oh, we still want power. We still want to, have our Supreme Court justices, have our, our president, all that stuff," or you create new patterns and practices. And I think one of the strengths of that is that it can speak to a non-Christian audience or outside of the church. Because I think if you were to go to a Muslim believer from Afghanistan and to say, "Hey, we want to teach you some songs about the power of God to conquer everything in the world," that could be misunderstood pretty easily, right? I mean, onward Christian soldiers, it can be very easily misunderstood in a different context. Versus a cry out to, "We are broken in our humanity, our common humanity is broken. We all need you because we are fallen and broken." The lament, that's a common human experience. And so some of our triumphalistic victory songs come out of a particular cultural context. Other contexts would not understand that. And so that's why I agree with you 100% that lament is actually an entry point into a community that would not look at Christianity the way the Western church or the church in power would look at Christianity. Churches in power, right? Actually, Korea would be similar, right? There's, and the US certainly, or the assumption of churches in power, we create a style of worship, a style of doing church that is geared towards the retaining of that power. Now, when you have groups that are marginalized in that community, the Black church, the immigrant church, new recent refugees and immigrants, whose marginalization is actually due to the power dynamics of that group, right? So if you're an immigrant coming to the US and the dominant culture caused the reason for your immigration, the war was in your country because of the dominant culture group. Do you take on the patterns of that dominant culture group, or is the gospel communicated that makes more sense in that context? So I speak this as an outsider, to be honest. I'm Korean, but I speak as an outsider. I feel like Korean culture has a lot of lament in it, right? Arirang is like, really, that's lament. I mean, I hear Korean songs, maybe not BTS, but all these Korean songs is real lament. K-drama is really lament. I mean, that's just a lot of crying and melodrama. That's lament. So I'm wondering if we've bought into some of these patterns of worship that make sense in a different cultural context. But if we really want to reach, non-believers and those outside the faith with the gospel, then lament actually makes more sense than some of the other ways that we've done. The other thing is, like, Western culture is very linear. And so some of the triumphalism, kind of like the Hegelian dialectic, it goes in a straight line upward and onward. It keeps going forward and forward and forward, progress, success. That's not the way life works. And so if you're coming from a community where that's not your narrative, right? In Western culture, we keep getting bigger and better and stronger and more money and bigger GDP. And that was a similar Asian tiger narrative, right? Korea and Taiwan, they're growing and growing and growing. But some of these communities like Afghanistan, that's not their narrative. That's not what connects with them. The idea of a linear straight line towards success in heaven. They've been through multiple cycles of superpowers conquering them over and over again. Every 10, 20 years, another superpower comes and tries to defeat them and set up a new government, and then they stick around for decades and nothing. So that's not linear. In fact, those who are coming in with their progress, it actually speaks to what oppressed them. And so that's why things like lament to communities that have experienced something different is really powerful.
I have a follow-up question for that. Many denominations do not have the Psalms of Lamentation in their hymnal. And part of the reason is also theological reflection that some of the songs of lamentation has strong sense of chosenness. We are chosen, they are the enemy.
That's good. Yeah.
You guys should do something about this situation.
Yeah.
Often calling for vengeance.
Yeah.
So how can we retrieve those lamentation without leading into more violence or more appealing to the sense of chosenness?
Yeah, that's very good. So in my book, I talk about Brueggemann's distinction, Walter Brueggemann's distinction between celebration theology and suffering theology. And sometimes we operate, and this is very similar to your question, sometimes we operate out of a celebration paradigm and take those ideas into our suffering paradigm. So for example, Brueggemann just says that the celebration comes from the haves. So these are communities and churches that have a lot of resources. They think about the word in a particular way, and the book is actually called Shalom. So he's trying to understand Shalom from the haves and the have-nots. So if the haves view the world through a particular lens, their theological framing and their exposure to lament is a particular way. So if you are a triumphalistic culture and you look at lament and you see that as, and I'm going to, again, my apologies for using so many US examples, but the American church, so steeped in triumphalism, culture of celebration, that, and then they read the laments, and instead of seeing God at work among the poor, they see the lament for themselves, right? And so they'll say, oh, look, white Christians, we're the most persecuted people in the US. I've actually heard that. White Christians are the most persecuted group in the United States. We're the minority that's dying. I mean, it's really kind of scary narrative that's in the US right now about this exceptionalism. And that comes from a people steeped in celebration trying to inappropriately co-opt lament. So that's where lament actually, to me, the way I've learned about lament is, one, my personal experience as an immigrant, as someone who grew up poor in a single family home, but my best teachers of lament were African Americans and Native Americans. And that's because, Willie Jennings at Duke and Jay Carter and Valerie Cooper and Emmanuel, these were all my professors at Duke who taught me about lament, not in those words, but as a suffering community who are able to tap into that narrative well, versus lament that says, we were once this, great Christian nation, not true, but, we need to get that back. And because of that, we need to recover, and they're lamenting the loss of white power or white Christian centrality. That to me feels like a people in celebration acting like they're living in the place of suffering. Whereas to me, the best way to do that is actually engage the stories of suffering. So one of the best ways I've experienced that is, again, learning from African-American mentors and Native American mentors. That's been a real learning place for me over the last 5-10 years, connecting with the Native American community. My co-author, Mark Charles, and his stories as a Native American. Our latest book is called Unsettling Truths, and the focus is on telling the Native American story. So I think it is an easy temptation for the privilege to co-opt and manipulate and use the stories of lament for their benefit. But the true, in a communal lament, you're not co-opting that story, you are actually embracing the story. So you're not centering yourself in the lament, you're centering the other in the lament.
Thank you. We have many questions coming from Zoom room. I have two questions related to shame. The first question is, how does the notion of shame, which is a very common sentiment in Asia, related to communal trauma and lament? It's a question from Katz Ukaya. And seconding that question, also coming from Hiro Katano, who says, how shame related to sin and harm.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, I didn't go into that in detail, but I do a little more writing on that in the book and other books that I've written about culture. And I entered into that when I was pastoring a multicultural church and recognizing that different members of my church, based upon their both racial, ethnic, and cultural background, had different perception of shame versus guilt. And this is a little bit simplistic, and I hesitate to use it, but this is the easiest way to explain it. The differentiation of guilt, which tends to be Western and individualistic, and shame, which tends to be non-Western or Eastern and a little bit more communal oriented. And the joke that I use, and this is, again, you got to think about the context of working with MIT and Harvard students, is that in America, a white family, when their kid doesn't get into Harvard, it's not a big deal because it's about the individual, right? So, all right, you feel guilty, but that's okay. You're just an individual. It's not a problem. Korean kid doesn't get into Harvard, then there's shame, right? I mean, there's a difference there. There's the guilt of the individual because it's an individual thing. For the Korean kid, it's shame. Your grandfather in Korea is ashamed of you because you didn't get into Harvard. So there's a very different way of looking at individual responsibility and this kind of sense of corporate shame responsibility. And I think lament gears more towards the shame-based type of approach, right? And there's some very simplistic ways, but again, sometimes it's helpful. You might have to nuance this. The individual guilt is, I did something personally wrong and I feel guilty about it, and I will do something personally right to make up for that personal guilt. Shame is, there's something that has happened that makes my being, who I am, deeply flawed. To me, that actually feels more biblical, right? It's not just my individual, but it might be my whole community. And so when we talk about, for example, racism in America, because it's such a hyper-individualistic, guilt-based culture, the language is, well, I never owned a slave. I never took land away from a Native American. I didn't, I've never personally done anything wrong, so I shouldn't feel guilty about, I don't feel like I'm a racist because I didn't do these individual sins. And so I don't need to lament. I don't need to repent. Whereas a shame approach would say, yes, but our community has benefited from that, right? Our community has benefited from my privilege. Our community has benefited from the systems that are in place. And so we might not feel individually guilty for individual action, but is there a corporate shame for our collective action and our collective privilege that we need to address? And so I think lament, again, does that in that there are individual laments repeatedly throughout the scripture, but there are also corporate laments. Jeremiah is actually a great example, because if there's any person who doesn't feel individual guilt, it would be Jeremiah, right? Individually, he does everything right. He says the right words. He's the faithful prophet to God. He does everything that an individual should do, so he feels no individual guilt. But Jeremiah Lamentations, what does he frequently say? We have sinned, O God, and I have sinned, O God. So that's actually not accurate through a guilt paradigm. Jeremiah has not sinned. Jeremiah did not do these things that he is confessing. But from a shame paradigm, his people have. His community has. And so that's where the differentiation of guilt and shame. Guilt might lead to oftentimes an individual repentance, which is very Western, but shame could lead to a societal repentance or a corporate confession, which is also very biblical in that that's the pattern you see in lament oftentimes is communal, not just individual.
Thank you. I think we have time for another question, but he will be available for Q&A tomorrow as well. So if your questions has not been answered, we will try to incorporate them tomorrow. This question is actually coming from tomorrow's speaker, Nina. I think it's a very nice way moving toward tomorrow. We have been talking mostly about the roles of victims in lamentation. So Nina's question is about where is God's will. So I will read it. She says, I personally find the experience of lamenting very necessary to discern God's will. Has this been your experience? How do you explain this work of the Spirit of God through lament?
Yes, thank you. And I hope, Nina, you'll be able to expand for us tomorrow. That great question. That would be something that we would love to hear from you on. I do touch upon this with my experience at Stateville, that my theology has been incomplete if I didn't engage lament. And this is something that's been helpful for me to think through, especially in a Western culture where you achieve these markers and you're supposed to be an expert in these. You know, I have 2 master's degree and two doctoral degrees, and they're all in theology. And so, you know, there's that kind of assumption of I've hit these markers, the doctorates and the masters, and therefore I've attained a sufficient sense of intellectual knowledge. And so for me, the Spirit moving through that classroom in that prison, by the way, it was a bodily experience to be in that prison. So that's kind of the other part of it. All of this kind of up here, intellectual, you know, our growth is all up in our head. And then when you walk into that space and the gate closes behind you, and the gate won't open until the gate closes, and you hear, it's a heavy door, the clanging sound of that door closing, and then you wait, you're in a room that you cannot get out of, and then the clanging sound of that second door opening, and then you walk through, and then you begin to hear the noise of the prison. It's a visceral experience. It's not something you can intellectualize. Even now, you can't feel what I felt going into that prison, to be in that room, and you'll feel it, you know, in different places in different ways. But that kind of experience is absolutely essential. And sometimes we forget that when we talk about the Spirit moving, it's not just intellectual or even spiritual, emotional. There's a physical experience that comes when the Spirit speaks in these kind of spaces. And that's what I felt walking into that prison. And the experience of the bodily hug that Corzel gave me, those are spiritual experiences. So for me, the transformation has come by being in those spaces that allows me to have the hope that God has found in all these different spaces. The possibility that my understanding of God was incomplete. And by being in that prison, with my dear prison brothers, that's what makes my theology complete. And I think reconciliation doesn't come until that happens. Reconciliation simply becomes, again, joining hands in hospital visit where we sing Kumbaya and then we're done. It's the deep, profound sense of there's something that I'm lacking in my theology, in my spirit, in my life, that this other person that is extraordinarily different from me offers me, that without that, my life and theology are incomplete. That to me is where the spirit can oftentimes move.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to listen to you. It is rare to cry and laugh during lecture and also lament and see the signs of hope at the same time. It was that kind of experience we had together here. So thank you so much, and we're looking forward to having more conversation with you.